Доброе утро, дорогие участники Международной молодежной научной школы исследования космоса, теория и практика. Сегодня у нас продолжается работа школы, и мы с нетерпением ждем лекцию уважаемого нашего гостя, лектора, но он не гость, он соруководитель программы этой на протяжении многих лет, более 10 лет. Это человек, который возглавлял космическое агентство Соединенных Штатов Америки в течение 18 лет, и под руководством которого были очень многие технологии созданы и реализованы. И сегодня мы с удовольствием, с нетерпением ждем лекцию о программе Аполлонов, о программе пилотируемых полетов на Луну. Это мистер Джордж Эбби, который в настоящее время работает в университете Райса в Хьюстоне и является главным научным сотрудником. Пожалуйста, мы приглашаем мистера Эбби сегодня к нам в качестве самого главного действующего лица нашей встречи.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We are continuing the work of the Summer Space School, and today we've got the longly anticipated lecture of the person who's been heading Johnson Space Center for 18 years and who contributed a lot to the development of the human space flight in the US, and who's been a co-director of this program for 10 years. And this is the senior fellow of Baker Institute for Public Policy, Mr. George Eby. And George is about to give us a lecture on the lunar exploration and in particular on Apollo program.
No doubt. Good for that. Yep, click it. Click. No doubt. It needs to be at that other one. You need to share screen. Are you sharing screen?
Share screen. Hit share screen.
You're supposed to share. You're supposed to share screen. Hit escape.
Good morning.
Hit escape.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Hit escape.
Yes, we are hearing you pretty well.
And you can see my first slide?
Nope.
Hit escape. Hit escape. Hit escape. Escape on your keyboard. Where's the meeting? Where's the meeting? Where's your meeting? Where's your meeting? Where's your meeting? Please. Where's it? Give it to me. Give it. Yeah. And
We can see the PowerPoint now. It's good.
You can see it now?
Yes.
Very good. Well, I thought this morning I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Apollo program and the origin of the Apollo program and the various missions that we flew in Apollo. I had was fortunate enough to be involved in the program right from the first flight. The space program that really got it all started was started 64 years ago this October when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. That had a great impact in the United States. It had a great impact all over the world. And it proved, I think, the technological capability of the Soviet Union. The United States at that time effort in space was not very focused. And even though we were trying to launch a satellite at the same time that the Soviet Union did, And when we did try that in December of 1957, it failed. And we did not launch a satellite successfully until the end of January 1958. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Is he going to translate, or should I continue?
You can continue, as our working language is English. I guess everyone can understand you perfectly fine.
But the Soviet Union continued to make great achievements in space, flying animals in space and flying dogs, and started a program to launch a human in space, with Yuri Gagarin as the first human that would fly in space. And in the United States, the Congress of the United States and the president decided they would focus the space efforts in the United States under a civilian agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And they formed that in October of 1958. And in December of 1958, the United States also started a program to launch humans in space. This is a picture of Yuri Gagarin, of course, the first human that did fly in space. And this is the group of 7 astronauts that were selected in the United States when the program was initiated in December of 1958. 7 astronauts were selected, and the first astronaut to fly was on the far right, Alan Shepard. And then to his left is John Glenn, who was the first actual American to orbit in space. But the new president came in 1961, in January 1961, John F. Kennedy. The program was underway, and John F. Kennedy and his administration, when they came in, had great promise for improving the technology of the United States, improving our capability. And 3 months later, after he came in April of 1961, the Soviet Union made another big impact on all over the world when they launched Yuri Gagarin into space. And the United States had also formed a space council when NASA was formed. It was headed by the Vice President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. And this group was charged with overseeing the space program and making recommendations on what could be done to improve the program and move it forward. And Vice President Johnson was the chairman of the Space Council. And after Yuri Gagarin's flight on April 12th, here's Yuri Gagarin going out to the launch pad and his launch. After he launched successfully on April 12th and orbited the Earth, 8 days later, President Kennedy wrote a memo to Vice President Johnson, asking him to come up with a recommendation on what could be done to give us, the United States, a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space, or a trip around the moon, or a rocket to land on the moon. And he made that request of the Vice President on April 20th. We had not yet flown our first astronaut, Alan Shepard. Alan Shepard flew on May 5th, 1961, about 3 weeks after Yuri Gagarin flew. And this is his launch. It was a suborbital launch, lasted only about 15 minutes, and it was flown on a Redstone booster. And after his launch, he was entertained at the White House by President Kennedy and also Vice President Johnson. And Vice President Johnson came back in response to the Kennedy's memo, and he recommended that the United States send astronauts to the moon and return them safely to the Earth. And so on May 25th, about 6 weeks after Yuri Gagarin flew, President Kennedy made a speech to a joint session of the United States Congress. And he stated on May 25th, 1961, that we were going to go take humans to the moon and bring them safely back to the Earth and do it by the end of the decade. At that point in time, we didn't know how we were going to get to the moon, but we were committed to go to the moon. And that was in May of 1961. And there are 3 different approaches that were considered at that time. One was a direct ascent to the moon, which required a very large rocket. And the other was Earth orbit assembly, which would assemble a spacecraft in Earth orbit and take a number of launches and then fly to the moon. And then there was a third approach that came up with, it was put forward by a young engineer at the Langley Research Center of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a young engineer named John U-Boat. And he came up with a recommendation called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And Lunar Orbit Rendezvous would put a landing craft that landed on the moon and a craft that would take the astronauts to and from the moon, all on one booster, or a very large booster. And the 2 spacecraft would go into orbit around the moon, and the lunar module, the landing craft, would descend to land on the moon, and it would consist of 2 stages. And when the astronauts completed their activities on the moon, they would take the ascent stage, the upper stage, and lift off from the moon in rendezvous with the astronaut who would be flying the other spacecraft in lunar orbit, and then return to the Earth. And that was the approach that was selected finally, the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. It took us a year to make that decision. It was made in July of 1962. And in January 1962, we initiated the efforts to build the Saturn V, the large rocket that ended up really being our main rocket for all our lunar landings. And so by July, with a decision made on the approach and with a large rocket under development, we got the program underway. At that point in time, we had not completed the Mercury program. The first Mercury flight was flown, as I say, in May of 1961. And then John Glenn didn't fly into orbit until February of 1962. And then we flew four more Mercury flights, and the Mercury program was completed in May of 63. But we had concluded very early that with the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, we would need to have a lot of experience doing rendezvous in space and doing dockings in space. And that Mercury program did not give us that kind of experience. So in January 62, we started a new program called the Gemini program, which would take 2 astronauts in a spacecraft into Earth orbit. And we would practice doing rendezvous and dockings in Earth orbit. We would also develop the systems that we would need to take the spacecraft to the moon, the reliable systems, and in particular, the fuel cells that would provide the electrical power. They were all developed on Gemini. And Gemini was a vital step on our way to the moon, because without the experience we gathered from Gemini and doing the rendezvous and dockings, we would have never really been successful with the Apollo program. And so the last Gemini flight, first Gemini flight was flown in March of 1965, and the last flight was flown in November of 1966. And so while we were doing all this, we were also developing the Apollo spacecraft, the command and service module that would take the astronauts to and from the moon. It was being built by North American Aviation in California. And then the lunar module that was built by the Grumman Aircraft Company in Long Island, New York. So those two spacecraft were under development at the same time. We were flying Mercury and we were flying Gemini. So when the last Gemini flight flew in November 1966, the first Apollo spacecraft was already moving to the launch pad. And it was flown by going to be flown by three astronauts, Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee. And these were the three astronauts that were going to fly the first mission. It was going to be flown in February of 1967. And this is a picture of their spacecraft as it was going through processing in California. And this is a picture of it on the launch pad. In January of 67, about a month before the launch of the first Apollo mission, we were doing a countdown demonstration test on the launch pad, which was a dress rehearsal for the launch that we would make a month later in February. And during the countdown demonstration test, everything is put in order just like it will be on launch day. So the three astronauts were in the spacecraft. And at that time, we were flying with 100% oxygen in the spacecraft atmosphere. And we were proceeding with the test. And we had an unfortunate fire that developed on the launch pad, and the three astronauts lost their lives. It was the spark had initiated the nylon in the spacecraft. We had a lot of flammable materials in the spacecraft, a lot of Velcro that the astronauts had wanted to put in so they could attach things while you're in 0G. And that was all made of nylon. So there was a lot of combustible materials in the spacecraft. And as it turned out, the wiring for the components into the command module were worn because people had been not caring for the wires. We had a spark, and that ignited the nylon and ended up with a fire. The astronauts weren't burned to death, but they were asphyxiated. So we lost the astronauts, and the program had a major setback at that time. We had to, of course, really identify what was the cause of the problem and solve that problem. And because we had a lot of flammable material in the spacecraft and we were flying with 100% oxygen, we had to develop all kinds of new materials that didn't burn in oxygen. And that was a major activity because we had to invent the material. And then once we proved that they didn't burn in 100% oxygen and just about everything will burn in oxygen, we had to fabricate all the material inside the spacecraft and the spacesuits and everything that was associated with the astronauts out of this non-flammable material. At the same time, we developed a quick opening hatch because part of the problem with the astronauts dying was associated with the difficulty of opening the hatch when the fire occurred. And we did a complete redesign on the hatch. It was an inward opening hatch before, at the time of the fire. And we designed a quick opening, outward opening hatch to get around that problem. We also looked at all the spacecraft systems and improved those systems and improved the reliability of all the systems on board the spacecraft. So it was a time of great effort, developing all the new non-flammable materials, looking at all the spacecraft systems and improving their reliability and redundancy. And then, of course, getting the program back on track. And that took us 21 months. We had the fire in January 1967, and we were finally ready to fly in October 1968. And the first crew to fly the first manned mission was Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and Walt Cunningham. They were the backup crew for the Apollo 1 mission. And this mission was going to be flown in October. At that point in time, I was working for George Low, who's the Apollo spacecraft program manager. And George took over the program after the fire and had been working pretty much 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And in the summer of 1968, he took about a week off. And he came back after a week's vacation. And he told me that he felt that if we stayed on the present course with the missions as they were to be flown, that we wouldn't land on the moon before the end of the decade. So he felt that something had to be changed. And so he came up with an idea that if Apollo 7 was successful in October of 1968, the next mission, which was to be flown 2 months later in December, we would take the command module, command and service module, without the lunar module, without the vehicle that would land on the moon because it was delayed. We would take the command and service module and do a mission in orbit around the moon. And he was able to convince the NASA leadership that that was a good approach. And they finally decided that they would consider that, but only if Apollo 7 was a complete success. And so they would make a decision after Apollo 7 flew in November. They would make a decision as to whether we could go to the moon on Apollo 8. And Apollo 8 was going to be the first manned flight of a Saturn V. And that was one of our other problems, in that the Saturn V had flown 2 unmanned missions. One mission in November of 1967 that was very successful, but then a mission that was flown in April of 1968 that was not successful. It had major vibrations, and 2 of the engines on the second stage shut down, and the third stage engine wouldn't restart, and we had to have that restart if we were going to go to the moon. And the spacecraft LEM adapter, the structure around where the lunar module was stowed on the booster, it came apart in flight. So that was in April. And so if we're going to fly Apollo 8, the first manned mission to the moon, we had to fix all those problems on the launch vehicle, in addition to getting the spacecraft ready. So that was a major effort on everyone's part. And Apollo 7 flew in October 68 with the 3 crewmen, Wally Shaw in the middle and Walt Cunningham on the right, and Don Isley on the left. Here's the launch from Cape Kennedy. This is a picture that they took of in orbit of the state of Florida. You can see the whole state of Florida. It's one of the better pictures that was taken of Florida. And you can see the launch site where they launched from right in the distance there. This mission was completely successful. It flew 10 days and was the first manned mission of Apollo. And because it was successful, there was agreement that we would take Apollo 8, the next mission, 2 months later, to the moon. And so Apollo 8 with Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, shown here in this picture, would fly that mission on the first flight of a Saturn V to the moon. And on December 21st, 1968, they launched on their mission to the moon. And they arrived in lunar orbit on Christmas Eve of 1968. And the first time the world got a view of the moon close up, because they had a television camera. We've been flying a television camera on Apollo 7, and this was the second mission we flew a television camera. So the world got a first close-up look at the moon as they showed that picture out from the spacecraft window. This is the launch of Apollo 8. This is a picture they took of South America on their way to the moon. You can see the whole continent of South America in this picture, and you see North America up to the left. They arrived in lunar orbit on Christmas Eve, and there's a picture taken out the window, and they read from the Bible as they circle the moon.
Unadvertising working place. We're now going over approaching one of our future landing sites, selected in this smooth region to call the Sea of Tranquility. Smooth in order to make it easy for the initial landing attempts, in order to preclude having to Dodge Mountains. Now you can see the long shadows of the lunar sunrise. We're now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament, the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
That was a very emotional Christmas Eve in 1968 with the crew reading from the Bible as they circled the moon. And it had an effect on people all over the world. And it was a very emotional event. They returned successfully on December 27th and was a very successful mission. But at that point in time, we still hadn't flown the lunar module. And the next mission, Apollo 9, would fly 2 months later on a Saturn V, and it would be the first flight of the command and service module, which you see is a spacecraft on the left, and then the lunar module, the spacecraft on the right. And they'd be both flown on the Saturn V, and it would be an Earth orbital flight. And it was flown by Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott, and Rusty Schweickart. Here you see all three astronauts, Jim McDivitt on the left and Dave Scott in the middle and Rusty Schweickart on the right. And they launched in early 1968, 2 months after Apollo 8. And this is their launch as it's taken from Cape Kennedy. They got into Earth orbit, and two of the astronauts went into the lunar module after they had docked with the lunar module and separated from the upper stage of the Saturn V. They docked with the lunar module, and then two astronauts, Jim McDivitt and Rusty Schweickart, got into the lunar module. And this is a picture taken when they just separated from the command and service module. You can see the upper stage of the lunar module and the lower stage. And you can see the landing pads on the vehicle and the probes that told you how high above the surface of the moon you'd be. They separated from the command and service module about 500 miles, and then they re-rendezvoused and docked successfully. And we had proven very well the lunar module. We also did a EVA out the hatch of the command and service module, Rusty Schweickart did, and that was with a new suit that we were going to use on the moon. So it gave us an opportunity not only to prove the lunar module, but also to prove the suit. And 2 months later, we were then scheduled to fly Apollo 11 or Apollo 10. And Apollo 10 would be flown by Tom Stafford, who would be later commander of the Soyuz Apollo mission, the US commander of the Soyuz Apollo mission, and flown by John Young and Gene Cernan. This is a picture of a young Tom Stafford on the right and John Young in the middle and Gene Cernan on the left. This mission would be a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. It would not land on the moon, but Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan would go into the lunar module after they got into lunar orbit. They would separate from the command and service module that would be flown by John Young. They would descend to a low altitude over the landing site of Apollo 11 and take photographs of that landing site so we could study those photographs before we flew that mission, the landing mission, Apollo 11. This is the launch of Apollo 10 on May 18th of 1968. And this is a picture taken of the lunar module in lunar orbit by John Young after Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan had separated from the command and service module. They descended to a low altitude in lunar orbit over the landing site, about 40,000 feet over the landing site. The lunar module couldn't land because it was too heavy to land and wouldn't be able to lift off. But they tested the system, the ascent stage, and they fired the ascent stage and came back up and re-rendezvoused with the command and service module. This is a picture of the lunar module upper stage as it came into dock with the command and service module that was flown by John Young. John took this picture as they came into dock. The mission was quite successful, and we had really proven all our systems. So we felt we could do a landing 2 months later in July of 1969. And this is Apollo 11 to be flown in July of 1969. And this is the crew: Neil Armstrong and Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin. Neil on the left and Mike in the middle and Buzz on the right. And this is a picture of their booster going out to the launch pad, getting ready for launch. And this is a picture of it being launched on July 16th of 1969. And this is a picture taken of Vice President Johnson, who is of course not in office at that time, but he and his wife were present at the launch. And so they were instrumental in the recommendation to go to the moon. And here they were seeing actually the first mission of a landing on the moon. And here's a picture taken of Neil Armstrong descending to the surface of the moon. We had set up a camera that we flew on the lunar module so we could observe the astronauts on the surface of the moon. And so this picture is actually a television picture taken of Neil as he descended the ladder before he stepped down on the surface of the moon. One small step for man, but a giant leap for mankind. And this is a picture of Buzz Aldrin after they put the American flag on the moon. There are no pictures of Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon because he had the camera. So all the pictures that were taken on the surface were Buzz Aldrin. There is a picture taken of Buzz where you can actually see Neil in the reflection of his helmet. So you do get a picture of Neil there in the reflection on Buzz's helmet. But the mission was very successful, of course, and we landed on the moon on July 20th. And this is a picture taken in the control center in Houston, right after the crew had gotten on board the carrier after we picked them up out of the ocean. And we had proven that we could get to the moon by the end of the decade. We got there in July of 1969. So we were flying missions at that time every 2 months. So we felt we could relax a little bit. And so we didn't fly our next mission, Apollo 12, until November, 4 months between missions. And this mission was flown by Pete Conrad on the left, Dick Gordon in the middle, and Al Bean on the right. And at that point, we wanted to prove our capability of landing on a being able to land on a exact spot on the moon. We had mass concentrations on the moon that were giving us trouble with our navigation. So this mission was designed to land at a specific location near a Surveyor spacecraft that had landed on the moon in 1967. And so we targeted this mission to land at that site. The launch, as the initial part of the launch was successful, but unfortunately we had launched right after a cold front had gone through Cape Kennedy. And as we launched, lightning was ignited and came back and hit the spacecraft. So, and the lightning struck the spacecraft. We got all kinds of red lights. We lost our electrical power. We lost our platform, our platform and our references. And the crew was faced with a myriad of red lights. And they called and said that they thought they'd been hit by lightning, and they indeed had been hit by lightning. And they were losing all their electrical power, and they didn't have any control. So one of the young controllers in the control center had seen this kind of a loss of power before, and he made a call within 10 seconds to the capsule communicator to the spacecraft and told the crew to reposition one switch in the spacecraft, and that repositioning of that switch regained all the power. So he was able to make that recommendation because he had been doing simulations and training and had been following the electrical systems and knew the electrical systems quite well. So he really saved the spacecraft. So we continued to launch and got into Earth orbit. And of course, since we've been struck by lightning, we wanted to get the confidence that all our systems were working correctly before we went to the moon. And we spent a good bit of time checking all the systems and regaining our confidence that everything was working properly. And then we did a translunar injection to the moon. And the mission went completely successful from that point on. And this is a picture of the lunar module where we targeted to land near the Surveyor spacecraft. And in the foreground, you see the Surveyor spacecraft. And in the background, you see the lunar module. So we were very successful in our targeting, and the astronauts were able to do an EVA over to the Surveyor and remove parts from the Surveyor and return them to Earth. So we were able to see what the effects of the lunar environment on spacecraft components would be on the surface. The mission was quite successful, and the next mission was planned to be 4 months later, and it was Apollo 13. And of course, this mission has gotten a lot of publicity, and you're going to hear about this mission 2 days from now, when the lunar module pilot, Fred Hayes on the left, is going to talk to you about the Apollo 13 mission. That's Fred on the left and Jack Swigert in the middle, and Jim Lovell, the commander, on the right. And you see the lunar module in the foreground and the command and service module on the right. Jack Swigert was a last minute addition to this crew. He was on the backup crew, and Ken Mattingly, who had been on the prime crew, had been exposed to measles during the pre-flight period. And there was a concern that he had not had measles, that he would come down with measles during the flight. So we changed out Ken Mattingly and put Jack Swigert on the mission. And he did 2 days of training with the crew, and they were satisfied they could work as a team. And so they launched Apollo 13. And this is the launch of Apollo 13. The mission was going quite well, and we were on our way to the moon, and the crew had already docked with the lunar module. And so we had docked with the lunar module, and we were doing a television presentation from the spacecraft on the way to the moon. And right after the television show was completed, the control center asked the astronauts to stir the cryogenic tank. and use a fan, electrical fan that was in the cryogenic tanks to stir the fan to get a better reading on the cryogenics. And when they did that, there was a spark and an explosion. And we started losing oxygen. We lost our electrical power because we lost our fuel cells. And so it was a major problem. And it took a little while to recognize that we were in a serious situation. So we put the crew over into the lunar module because the lunar module was still attached, and we could keep the crew alive in the lunar module. And we shut down the electrical power, all the electrical systems in the command and service module, because we wanted to conserve the power, what power there was. And there were batteries in the command and service module that we could use for entry, after we entered the Earth's atmosphere. So we wanted to conserve those batteries. So we shut down everything in the command module, moved the crew into the lunar module, and they lived in the lunar module. And this is a trajectory, the nominal Apollo 13 mission profile. Normally we were on what was called a free return around the moon, where we would take the spacecraft around the moon, and it would come back to the Earth, into the Earth's atmosphere. Because we were going to a different landing site, we had got off the free return trajectory after the explosion occurred, and we had to get back on to the free return trajectory, and did mid-course corrections. We couldn't use the command and service module engine because the explosion had occurred there. And so we had to come up with a plan to use the lunar module engine and use it in a way that it hadn't been designed to be used. And we were able to successfully do that and make all the mid-course corrections that we needed to make so that the spacecraft would circle the moon, come back into the Earth's atmosphere, and come back at a landing site where we could recover the crew. When living in the lunar module was designed to be operated on the lunar surface. It had batteries for 2 days operation on the lunar surface. It had lithium hydroxide canisters that scrubbed the air and made the air pure so the astronauts could live. But we very quickly ran out of the lithium hydroxide canisters on the lunar module. But we had a large number of the lithium hydroxide canisters from the command module. So this is a picture of a way we came up with jury-rigging the command and service module lithium hydroxide canisters so they would operate in the lunar module. We came up with an approach to do that and communicated it to the crew, and then they fabricated a system so they could use the lithium hydroxide canisters from the command module to keep the air pure in the lunar module. The electrical power had to be conserved in the lunar module, so it was very cold. It was, the temperatures were quite cold, but the crew was able to survive. And after we came back on our free return trajectory back toward the Earth, just before we got into the Earth's atmosphere, the crew moved from the lunar module into the command module, and then they separated the service module before they entered the Earth's atmosphere. And after they separated, they were able to take this photograph of the effect of the explosion. It blew out the side of the service module. You can see that whole side was blown away. And the lunar module was jettisoned, of course, and ended up landing in the Pacific Ocean. And the command service module was able to come in on batteries. We still had battery power in the command module. And so they were able to use the parachutes and come back into the Earth's atmosphere. And this is a picture of Apollo 13 as it descended into the Pacific Ocean. The mission, as it turned out, was successful in the sense that we were able to recover the crew. We had, of course, had to find out what caused the problem and fix that problem. And we were able to identify and reproduce the cause of the problem. The tank that had been flown had been dropped during the processing and damaged the liquid filling of the tank. And then it also had been exposed to excessive voltages when it was going through ground testing on the Cape. And the excessive voltages had burned up the wiring. And so the wiring had caused a spark and ignited the oxygen in the tank and blew up the tank. So that took us 9 months to really go through that and get ready to fly again. And Apollo 14 was the next mission. And it flew in January 1971 with Alan Shepard, Stu Roosa, and Ed Mitchell. Alan Shepard, the first American astronaut to fly on the suborbital flight of Mercury, and then Ed Mitchell on the left and Stu Roosa on the right. This was their first flight. We had wanted to, on all of subsequent flights after Apollo 11, we tried to maximize the science on the mission. So on each of the missions, we spent a good bit of time really trying to maximize where we landed and go through a very lengthy process with the scientists to select a landing site so that we could obtain more data on the origin of the moon. And so each of the missions after Apollo 11 landed at different landing sites with the idea that we could characterize the formation of the moon. And so Apollo 14 landed it ended up landing at the site originally designated for Apollo 13. This is a picture of Apollo 14 right before launch. And this is a launch picture of Apollo 14. And this is a landing on the moon, the lunar module on the moon. And you see an antenna on the left there that allowed us to control a television camera so we could follow the astronauts on the surface. And we wanted, as I say, to maximize the science. And because the astronauts had to carry the experiments around to place on the moon, we decided that we would give them a mobile transporter that they could put their experiments on and then pull that and take that as they did their extravehicular activities on the surface so they wouldn't have to carry everything themselves. And that worked quite successfully. And the mission, of course, had proven that everything we had problems with on Apollo 13 was resolved. And we went ahead, of course, with the next mission, Apollo 15. And it was designed to also maximize the science. And we flew that mission in 1971. And it was flown by Dave Scott, who had flown on Apollo 9, Al Worden, who was his first flight, and Jim Irwin on his right. And that was Jim Irwin's first flight as well. And on this mission, as I say, we wanted to maximize the science and give the astronauts an opportunity to get further away from the lunar module and be able to gather more samples from the moon and be able to place their experiments at a good distance from the spacecraft. And this is the launch of Apollo 15. And on Apollo 15, we took a small vehicle to the moon, a lunar rover. And this is a picture of the rover going through testing. You see it had wire mesh wheels to run on the surface of the moon. And the lunar rover vehicle was carried on the side of the lunar module. And here you see a depiction of the astronauts as they got on the surface of the moon and then lowered the lunar module to the surface of the moon. And they were able to have a vehicle where they could travel on the moon. And this is a picture of the lunar rover on the surface of the moon on Apollo 15. And you see a television camera in the foreground that was mounted on the lunar rover. And there's an antenna right adjacent to it. And when the astronauts would get at a certain spot, they would point the antenna at the Earth, and then we could control the television camera and follow them as they did their activities on the lunar surface. And this is a picture taken of the lunar rover, and you can see the antenna there on the left. This mission went to the lunar highlands, and you can see in the picture that This is a landing site quite different than Apollo 11. You can see the hilly terrain in the background. And again, this was done purposely to try to characterize the origin of the moon. Apollo 16 was the next mission, and at that point in time, we were flying missions more than 6 months apart. So Apollo 16 didn't fly till the spring of 1972, and it was flown by John Young, who flew on Apollo 10, and then Ken Mattingly, who was taken off the crew of Apollo 13, and Charlie Duke. And this was Ken Mattingly and Charlie Duke's first flight, and it was John Young's second flight to the moon, and he had gone to the moon on Apollo 10. And this is John Young practicing in a lunar rover training vehicle on the surface of the Earth, practicing before his mission. And you see that the vehicle didn't have wire mesh wheels. We didn't need those on the surface of the Earth. Actually, the hard rubber tires work much better. And you can see the fenders there on the wheels to prevent dust flying back up into the astronauts. And this is a picture you can see with the antenna prominently in the foreground. Apollo 16 launched successfully. And this is a picture John Young took on the way to the moon. And it's one of the best pictures we have of North America. You can see the whole continent of North America. You can see Baja, California. You can see Houston in the lower right, and Florida, and well up into Canada. This is a picture taken of John Young on the surface of the moon by Charlie Duke. And in that you only have 1/6 gravity on the surface of the moon. John is well off the surface of the moon because he leaped when the picture was being taken. So he's well above the surface of the Earth, of the moon. And you can see on the lunar module, the ladder had first rung on the ladder was considerably up from the surface of the moon because they could actually jump up to that ladder. And this is, of course, one of the great pictures that was taken on Apollo 8, and the first time we were able to observe the Earth from the moon. This is a picture that was taken on Apollo 16, and you can see the Earth and it stand out against that great black background. And this, of course, I think increased environmental awareness about the Earth and caused people to really get more concerned about the environment of the Earth and preserving that environment, because you can see what a great place it is and how it compares to what else is out there in space. And I think it certainly improved and made more people aware of the environment. And since that time, people have been really paying more attention to that environment. And this is a picture of Apollo 16 landing in the ocean. The last mission of Apollo was Apollo 17, and it was flown by Gene Cernan, who flew on Apollo 10 as a commander, and then 2 new astronauts, Jack Schmitt on the left and Ron Evans. And Jack Schmitt was the first geologist that was actually flown to the moon. So we were able to take a geologist on at least the last mission to try again to maximize the samples and learn more about the moon. And as I say, we tried to maximize the science, and here's Jack Schmitt and Gene Cernan training in a locale that was much like the surface of the moon, training to do their geology, looking at how they could maximize that geology on the surface of the moon. So this was a training session for Gene and Jack. Both these pictures depict training missions, one unsuited and one suited. And as I say, the astronauts would launch off the surface of the moon after they had done their activities on the surface in the upper part of the lunar module. And this is an artist's depiction of the launch of the ascent stage off the moon. And we wanted to get a picture of the actual launch of the Ascent stage. So we had the astronauts position the lunar rover in a position where the camera could be pointed right at the ascent stage and the lunar and the descent stage, so we could capture the launch. And this is a picture of the actual launch of Apollo 17 off the surface of the moon as they launched and went up to join the astronauts surfacing in lunar orbit. Ken Mattingly. Heard you, it was actually Ron Evans on this flight. And this is Apollo 17 coming back, landing in the ocean. And that was our last Apollo mission. Apollo missions had been planned 18, 19, and 20, but they had been canceled because of budgetary reasons. So those last 3 missions, we didn't fly. And the Saturn V's and the command modules that were intended for those missions had already been built. And those Saturn V's are on display, one in Houston, one in Florida, and one in Huntsville, Alabama. And the command and service modules were used to fly the Skylab program, our first space station mission that started in May of 1973. And it was also used, of course, to fly the Soyuz Apollo mission. So in actuality, we flew 9 missions to the moon, 6 landing missions, and 3 missions that one Apollo 13 had orbited the moon and Apollo 8 had orbited the moon, and Apollo 10 it didn't land. But we had 6 landing missions. And they were all at different locations. As I say, we tried to maximize the return from our samples, and you can see the various landing sites for the 6 missions, Apollo 16 and 17, or 15 and 17 up in the highlands, and 14 and 16 and 12 in different locations, and Apollo 11 right about on the equator. But we have all these samples in Houston, and we're still examining these samples, and investigators all over the world are still examining these samples. And each year we have a interplanetary and lunar surface conference where scientists from all over the world can come and present the results. And this, of course, has been going on ever since 1969, and it grows in numbers each year. And it will be occurring it did occur in the spring of this year, and we'll have another conference in the spring of next year. So that completes the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eby, for the interesting presentation you had here. And we are now ready to see if our audience has any questions.
Пока готовятся ребята, у меня вопрос такой, мистер Эбби. Почему прекратили осваивать Луну в пилотируемом режиме? Почему так долго не возвращались на Луну? Вот только сейчас идут разговоры о том, чтобы вернуться на Луну. С чем это было связано?
So the question is, Mr. Eby, why did we had to stop the human exploration of the moon, and why didn't we come back there for such a long time? Why are we returning to the moon only now?
Well, the missions are stopped by budgetary reasons. The President of the United States, President Nixon, felt we had fulfilled the goal of landing on the moon by the end of the decade, and felt that we should no longer continue to fly the missions even though I think we had the spacecraft and there was a great desire on everyone's part to continue to fly. The president and the president really had the last say on the budget and decided to cancel the missions. And even though there was a lot of support in the Congress and in the public and in the science community to do the missions. And it was unfortunate, and it's taken now a number of years, and we're still not back on the moon, surface of the moon with humans yet. And hopefully we can do that in the future. And as we're flying on the International Space Station, do it together with our colleagues in Russia.
Вот. Но программа была прекращена по финансовым бюджетным соображениям. То есть президент Никсон посмотрел и сказал, что цель достигнуть поверхности Луны до конца десятилетия выполнена. В общем-то, и несмотря на то, что у нас был и космический корабль нормально работающий, и желание продолжать, и была поддержка Конгресса, и общественности, и научного сообщества, то есть по финансовым соображениям программа была прекращена. Да, и действительно, мы очень долго не летали на Луну, и до сих пор мы туда не вернулись, но я думаю, что надо обязательно туда возвращаться, и возвращаться обязательно вместе в рамках такого международного сотрудничества, которое ведется сейчас, например, на борту Международной космической станции.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a question from Kirill. Kirill, please turn on your mic.
Здравствуйте, мистер Эбби. У меня есть вопрос. Почему изначально была выбрана схема с одним запуском сверхтяжелой ракеты, а не, например, сборкой лунного комплекса на орбите Земли и последующей отправкой его к Луне? На более легких ракетах, что, возможно, удешевило бы всю программу.
So my question is, you mentioned that at one point there were 3 approaches to fly to the moon, with 2 of them dominating, the direct ascent and the Earth orbit assembly. And as far as I know, the direct ascent originally was the primary one. Why was that? Why was that prioritized over the option where we could assemble the spacecraft in Earth orbit using the less powerful boosters?
Well, I think the approach we ended up with, the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, turned out to be, I think, the least risky approach. Once we had developed the capability to do the rendezvous and dockings, and we had the 2 spacecraft all in one booster, and it only required 1 launch. And we had the lunar module attached to the command and service module on the way to the moon. And had we not had that on Apollo 13, we would not have gotten the crew back. So it turned out to be a great approach, and gave us the redundancy of the lunar module being docked with the command module on the way to the moon. And so if there was a problem, as there was on Apollo 13, we had at least a lifeboat that the crew could survive. So there were a lot of advantages to Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And as we now go back to the moon, I think we have to be certainly conscious of the fact that problems do occur. And the voyage to the moon is a 3-day voyage, and it still has all kinds of risks and problems. And having the redundancy of a lunar module attached to the command module turned out to be a very good thing for us. And we ought to consider that as we look to go back to the moon and be sure we have redundancy and reliability in our systems. And I'm sure on 2 more days you can talk to Fred Hayes, and he can tell you more all about that.
Вот, но на самом деле это наиболее хорошо работающим оказался 3-й подход с последующей стыковкой на уже лунной орбите. Вот, то есть подход, когда на одной ракете запускался командный модуль и лунный модуль, и впоследствии происходила на пути к Луне стыковка командного модуля к лунному. И данный подход продемонстрировал свою надежность при аварии Аполлон-13, когда лунный модуль был использован в качестве спасательной шлюпки. И это, собственно говоря, такой основной фактор, почему удалось спасти экипаж в этом полете. Вот. И сейчас, когда мы собираемся возвращаться на Луну, нам тоже об этом постоянно нужно думать. Нам нужно думать о том, что аварии, они все-таки с определенной вероятностью случаются, и иметь вот такие возможности по резервированию, это очень полезно. Вот. Но о деталях и о преимуществах подхода такого к полету на Луну вы через пару дней можете узнать у Фреда Хейса, который вам будет все это дело рассказывать.
Okay, thanks.
Да. Еще вопрос?
More questions, please?
Mr. Eby, I actually have a question. Thank you for your presentation again. My question is about what are best for us for lunar exploration on our current point. Is it the lunar station like the moon gates, or how does it called this project, or it's better to make on lunar base and start our re-exploration of the moon from the base on the moon?
I didn't quite catch the question.
Yeah, let me rephrase it.
Yes.
Yes. So, what kind of approach, from your standpoint, would be more beneficial in continuation of the lunar exploration? Establishing a space station in the circumlunar orbit, such as the Gateway project, or starting with the lunar base to continue exploration from the surface?
I am not a supporter of building a space station to orbit a space station. The moon is a space station, and the approach that is being used right now is building a space station to orbit a space station. And I would say we should use God's given space station, the moon, and put our investment and our efforts into establishing a lunar base, and not continue building a space station in lunar orbit. We have proven a good way with lunar orbit rendezvous to get to the moon, and we should put our investment into building a lunar base, much like our bases in Antarctica, where we can explore and learn more about space and learn more about the moon and become accustomed to living long duration times in space. And that's where I think our approach should be, not on the present course.
Thank you.
Виктор, транслировать?
Ну, если такая просьба есть оттранслировать, то, по мнению мистера Эби, конечно, это лунная база. Значит, ответ был такой: я вообще против создания каких-либо орбитальных станций на орбите вокруг Луны, потому что Луна сама по себе является по отношению к Земле орбитальной станцией. Вот, поэтому, поскольку у нас есть хорошо отработанный подход к полетам к Луне с использованием стыковки на окололунной орбите, вот, все наши ресурсы, я считаю, которые в этом направлении у нас есть, мы должны направить на создание лунной базы, такой вот, например, как базы, существующие в Антарктике, вот, и уже оттуда продолжать изучать Луну и осваивать ее.
Thank you so much. Студенты, у вас вопросы есть?
Any questions from the students?
Федор? Ребята? Нет вопросов?
No questions.
Ну ладно, хорошо.
Okay.
Так, есть вопросы. Ну, давайте, задавайте вопрос.
Okay, so there are some questions. Go ahead, please.
Не стесняйтесь. Глеб, по-моему, там. Да?
Gleb, please turn on your mic and ask the question. He's got a problem with his microphone, so he can't actually ask it. I forgot. Значит, вопрос, кто, по вашему мнению, сейчас идет впереди в лунной гонке?
So there is a gentleman whose name is Gleb Ignatenko, whose microphone is malfunctioning. So he has sent us his question via the chat. And the question is, who, in your opinion, is leading the lunar race now?
Who's going to win the lunar?
Who is currently leading?
Win the lunar race? Well, I think it's going to take us a good while to get back to the moon. I think people are coming up with optimistic time schedules that we can get back to the moon. I think Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos with their companies are looking at going to the moon. And so you have also the United States has a lunar program, but I think it's not going to be happening as soon as people think it's going to happen. So I would say there's probably a good chance that maybe a commercial company will, like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, will be the first one back to the moon. And certainly the Chinese are also have been accomplishing great things on the moon as well. And they've launched a space station, and I'm sure they have a program that is looking at taking humans to the moon as well.
Вот, ну, на самом деле сейчас очень сложно сказать, кто же все-таки первым вернется на Луну, и даже сложно сказать, будет ли это страна или это будет коммерческая компания, потому что сейчас есть несколько проектов, то есть и компании Илона Маска, и компании Джеффа Безоса, они проводят проекты, направленные на высадку на Луне. Также существует программа полетов на Луну, которую проводит НАСА. Ну и здесь тоже нельзя забывать о Китае. То есть в Китае проводится много всяких интересных, замечательных вещей с точки зрения исследования Луны. Создана своя орбитальная станция и ставится целью доставка человека на Луну. Но я вполне могу допустить, что на самом деле первыми до Луны, ну, вновь долетит, может быть, и какая-то коммерческая компания, такая как SpaceX или Amazon Space. Blue Origin, точнее.
Blue Origin. Спасибо. Еще вопрос?
More questions, please.
Галя, что там с вопросами?
Ну вот,
Игорь Киреев тоже имеет вопрос, но у него микрофон не работает. Транслируйте его, пожалуйста.
Нет, он говорит, что прекрасная презентация настолько его поразила, что он не может даже сейчас придумать какой-нибудь все-таки вопрос, чтобы задать.
И он пишет, что у него есть вопрос, но вот не работает микрофон.
Ну, пусть он напишет вопрос, пожалуйста.
So another participant has got a question, but the microphone isn't working. So we are urging him to send the question via the chat.
Mr. Abbey, this is Jason. I'm wondering, why do you think the US and Russia are not working together to go to the moon?
Well, I think they're working very well together on the International Space Station. It's proven to be a great international activity. And I think the International Space Station has proven the benefits of working together, how much more can be accomplished. And we have now been, this last November, we've been continually manning the International Space Station with Russian and American astronauts for the last 20 years. And I think hopefully we can continue to apply the space station for a much longer period of time. And I think the US has probably not really laid out a program that would really give the Russians the opportunity to play a major role. And I think we need to change that and give Russia a major role working with the US so we can do it as we did on the International Space Station as a cooperative enterprise. And I think we would end up with a better base on the moon and a better operation if we were to work together. And I think it's a matter of the United States making their mind up to work together as they have on space station, work that way as we go back to the moon.
Виктор.
Ну, вопрос от Джейсона Лайенса был по поводу, по вашему мнению, почему в области лунных проектов нет такого хорошего взаимодействия между Соединенными Штатами и Россией? Ну, ответ был, что Россия и Соединенные Штаты могут в космосе очень хорошо и эффективно сотрудничать, что продемонстрировано более чем 20-летним опытом совместной эксплуатации Международной космической станции. То есть в ноябре месяце прошлого года было 20 лет постоянного присутствия экипажа на борту МКС. Поэтому, в общем-то, проблем как бы во взаимодействии-то и в самом сотрудничестве нет. То есть проблема в том, что, на мой взгляд, значит, в Соединенных Штатах была написана в свое время программа, где России не отводилось достаточно больших ролей в этом сотрудничестве. И с моей точки зрения этот курс должен быть скорректирован. России должна была быть предложена роль такая большая и ответственная, приблизительно так, как это происходит на МКС, и тогда, в общем-то, совместно мы сможем достичь многого.
Спасибо. Галя, дальше вопросы. Там, по-моему, Киреев генерил вопрос.
Да. Как вы думаете, в какой роли будет использована Луна в будущем? В качестве большой орбитальной базы, места сборки новых кораблей до полетов или как-либо еще? Игорь Киреев, вопрос.
So the question from Igor Kireev, who has finally formulated his question. What do you think, what kind of role the moon will be used in future? Will it be a large orbital base, a location to assemble the new spacecraft to fly to the deep space, or somehow else?
Well, I think the moon would be science stations on the moon would operate very much like our science stations that we have in the Antarctic today, where we have many nations with science stations, the Russian and US stations there. And we would work in that fashion on the moon. I think there is an opportunity, depending on how you could use lunar materials, that you could maybe generate a program where you could launch from the moon, but I think that's a distant program. I think our first emphasis ought to be on establishing scientific bases on the moon, where we can learn more about the moon, and also provides a vista beyond the atmosphere of the Earth, where we can see further and learn more about the universe. So I think it gives us a science station, and it gives us a potential as a launch pad for the future, and also gives us an opportunity to learn more about the universe.
Ну, я считаю, что в первую очередь там должны быть организованы научные базы, научные станции по образу и подобию того, как это все сейчас происходит вот в Антарктиде. То есть российская база, американская база и так далее. Вот, и таким образом мы будем изучать Луну. Мы, возможно, со временем сможем использовать лунные материалы для того, чтобы с Луны что-то запускать. Вот, поэтому и также, в общем-то, использовать Луну как вот такую уникальную научную базу внеземной атмосферы, с которой мы можем изучать космос и все больше и больше узнавать о нашей Вселенной. Поэтому вот вкратце научные базы и впоследствии база для запуска чего-то дальше.
Yeah, the moon would be a great site for a telescope.
Вот также Луна это будет замечательное место, где можно установить телескоп.
Thank you.
We have a question from Alexander Mikhailov. Alexander, please.
Oh, my question: which one of the proposed crew lunar landers you think has the most potential?
What is the question?
So which of the proposed designs of the lunar lander is more promising?
The present lunar lander?
Yes.
I don't like any of them.
Мне ни один из них не нравится.
I think we ought to go back to a design that we have proven, which is a lunar module, much like we used on Apollo. And I think that's a proven system, and we ought to improve on that. And I think that ought to be a starting point.
Вот, я считаю, что нам нужно вернуться к той концепции, которая у нас была во время программы Аполлон, тем более, что, в общем-то, конструкция отработана, и дальше, уже основываясь на этом, как-то дальше продвигаться. Использовать эту конструкцию в качестве отправной точки.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Gleb. Можете рассказать о проектах с Венерой, почему не особо пытались ее США изучать? Вот. Лишь СССР запустила пару станций, или эти проекты, связанные с Венерой, засекречены?
So the another question which is coming via the chat is, could you tell us about the projects to explore Venus? Why did the U.S. Why didn't U.S. Try to study Venus, and only the USSR launched a couple of probes, or those projects were classified?
I couldn't catch the question. What was the question?
So it appears that the U.S. didn't do much in terms of the exploration of Venus. Can you comment on that somehow?
Yes, well, I think the science program, apart from taking humans to the moon, is mostly robotic missions, and the emphasis has been really on Mars in the recent times, with our landings on Mars and the rovers on Mars, and that has been getting really more emphasis than Venus, but I think certainly Venus is important as well, and we need to not only learn about Mars, but need to learn about our other planets and the universe as well. So we should have a more balanced program that looks at all those planets and maximizes our return.
Вот, ну, в общем-то, действительно получается так, что в основном все усилия были направлены на Марс. Конечно, это не очень хорошо, потому что существует определенный дисбаланс, а научная программа должна быть сбалансирована. Конечно, понятно, что, в общем-то, человек ни на Марс, ни на Венеру не летал, все это делается автоматическими средствами, но считаю, что да, что нам нужно изучать все планеты нашей Солнечной системы для того, чтобы иметь все объемлющие такие знания о своей Солнечной системе.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. Спасибо большое за интересную лекцию. У меня есть вопрос. Почему сейчас в различных научно-популярных статьях говорят о постройке базы на Марсе, хотя даже на Луне они еще не были построены и не были отработаны необходимые технологии для длительного пребывания людей на иных телах Солнечной системы? Вопрос от Артема Щербака.
So another question coming through the chat, and this comes from Artyom Sherbak, and the question is, hello, thank you very much for the interesting lecture. I've got a question. So if you read the popular scientific journals these days, you will see a lot of articles which are telling about the development of the Martian base, although there are no lunar base now, and it doesn't seem like we've got enough technologies to establish the long duration human presence on the other celestial bodies. So in the other questions, why are we talking about the Martian bases once we can't build anything on the moon so far?
Well, I don't think that we should be putting emphasis on Mars for humans right now. I think it's going to be very difficult to take humans to Mars. It's not an easy task for radiation, and we don't have the systems that you would need for the long periods of time, the reliability of the systems to keep humans alive. We have a lot to learn about long duration missions in space and having systems that have reliability. And we have the moon, where we can learn to live and work in space and really get the knowledge that would allow us to go onto Mars. But I think working on a program of humans going to Mars at this point in time is premature. And what we should do is put our complete emphasis on a manned program for the moon and build those scientific stations there, and then prove out our systems, improve our reliability of our systems, and learn more about living and working in space. And then at some point in time, perhaps you could go to Mars. But I think right now, exploring Mars with robotic systems is a much better way to do it. And we can learn what we need to know about Mars with those robotic systems and focus on taking humans to the moon.
Вот, ну, я считаю, что в данный момент вот такого внимания полету человека на Марс уделять не нужно, потому что сам по себе полет на Марс — это очень большой клубок такой проблем, то есть там есть и проблема с радиацией, и проблема с надежностью систем. То есть сейчас у нас таких технологий нет, и я считаю, что наоборот нужно как бы все внимание уделять Луне, полетам человека на Луну, и таким образом мы сможем там построить вот эти вот научные базы, о которых я говорил, и там уже отрабатывать необходимые компоненты для полета на Марс, в частности, отрабатывать оборудование, отрабатывать его вопросы его надежности. И дальше уже, отталкиваясь от этого, в какой-то момент времени мы, наверное, сможем запустить миссию на Марс. Но сейчас говорить о полете человека на Марс, по моему мнению, преждевременно.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much.
Ну что, еще один вопрос, и будем заканчивать. Время наше уже подходит к завершению. Галя?
Так, ну пока я не вижу больше желающих.
And so far we don't see
Хорошо.
more people who would
Хорошо.
like to ask the questions.
Дорогой мистер Эбби, спасибо большое за такую содержательную лекцию, интересную, за то, что вы нас допустили в тот мир, когда были сделаны такие великие шаги, в части шаги на Луну. Спасибо вам большое. Мы будем стараться, чтобы все наши усилия, чтобы вся наша работа привела к тому, чтобы появились новые исследователи, которые будут осваивать планеты, будут продвигаться вперед. Человеку без этого жить будет нельзя. Нужно двигаться вперед. Спасибо вам большое. Мы надеемся, что в дальнейшем, в последующие дни нашей программы, вы также будете с нами, как и с самого начала.
So thank you very much, dear Mr. Reddy. Thank you very much for this comprehensive lecture and introducing us to this program, which resulted in the first steps of the humankind on the moon. And we'll keep doing our best to prepare the future explorers who would explore the moon and the planets of the solar system. So thank you very much again, and we strongly hope that you will be with us with the subsequent events of this summer space school. Thank you very much again.
Спасибо, it's been a pleasure.
Спасибо.
And, I wish you well with the rest of the rest of the workshop. And don't forget, Fred Hayes can answer all your questions on Apollo 13.
Желаю вам успеха с научной школой, и не забудьте, что Фред Хейс сможет ответить на все ваши вопросы по Аполлону 13.
Конечно, конечно, помним. Большое спасибо. Всем участникам спасибо. Хорошей продуктивной работы дальше, сегодня и в последующие дни. До свидания.
So thank you very much to everyone for attending this lecture. I wish you the best and good luck with your activities within the framework of the school program. And bye-bye.
Спасибо, Victoria.
Thank you.